Welcome to this historical explainer. Have you ever actually stopped to think about how the world we live in today came to be? It wasn't just some random series of events. It turns out human history operates on this incredible domino effect. We're talking massive shifts in thought, technology, and politics that connected together over centuries. Every time a domino fell, it triggered the next one, ultimately building the exact modern world we know today.
There's this absolutely brilliant quote by the historian David McCullough. He said, "History is who we are and why we are the way we are." I just love that, because it perfectly captures our goal for today. If we really want to understand our present existence, our laws, our economies, our human rights, we have to trace back the revolutionary changes that fundamentally transformed human history. So let's visualize exactly how we got here.
Here is our roadmap. We're going to be looking at 5 crucial dominoes today: the dawn of the modern era, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the American Civil War, and finally, the Industrial Revolution.
Just to ground us for a second, let's look at the macro timeline. We start with the ancient era of early settlements and those great sprawling empires. That's followed by the medieval period, which you've probably heard called the Dark Ages. Now, this 1,000-year stretch was heavily plagued by strict feudalism and a real lack of scientific advancement in Europe. But crucially, it served as this dark bridge connecting the ancient empires to the magnificent spark of the modern era.
All right, let's dive into our first massive shift. Section 1. Dawn of the Modern Era. The Awakening of Europe.
Picture this. Around the 12th to 14th centuries, as Europe slowly starts waking up from the Dark Ages, this radical new concept takes hold: humanism. It started in these incredibly wealthy Italian city-states, places like Florence and Venice, and it was the true intellectual awakening of the Renaissance. For centuries, society's entire center was the Orthodox Church, heavily focused on the afterlife, while humanism shifted that focus directly back to us, to humanity. It prioritized rational thinking, human development, and earthly well-being. Suddenly, art, literature, and science just exploded. But how did a massive shift like that actually happen? Well, it was kind of a perfect storm. The Crusades ended up exposing Europeans to highly advanced Middle Eastern mathematics. Then, in 1453, the fall of Constantinople pushed all these brilliant Greek and Roman scholars straight into Italy. Throw in Gutenberg's printing press, which literally democratized information, taking it right out of the hands of the elite, and Martin Luther's 1517 Reformation, which directly challenged the monopoly of the Catholic Church. Put all that together, and boom, you get a secular wave and the birth of scientific temperament across Europe.
But you know how it is. Ideas don't just stay contained. As European powers began exploring and colonizing the Americas looking for new trade routes, they packed these Enlightenment and Renaissance ideas right along with them. Which brings us to a fascinating question. What happens when this radical, human-centric thinking crosses the ocean and directly collides with the strict control of colonial empires?
Let's move to our second domino. Section 2. The American Revolution, the birth of independence. Okay, fast forward to the mid-18th century. 13 distinct, highly progressive colonies had developed over in North America. Built pretty much from scratch by people seeking economic opportunity and religious freedom, this American society was wildly different from the strict aristocratic classes back in Europe. And they very quickly clashed with a completely opposing worldview. Britain was drowning in massive debt from the 7 Years' War, so they viewed the colonies purely as an imperial asset, something to be taxed heavily via strict laws like the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act. But the American colonists, deeply influenced by those new ideas of individual liberty, they demanded no taxation without representation. They just flat out refused to be taxed by a parliament where they had zero voice. As you might guess, this ideological clash escalated fast. Tensions boiled over with the Boston Tea Party in 1773. By 1774, the colonies united under the First Continental Congress, and then, on July 4, 1776, they took the ultimate leap and adopted the Declaration of Independence. Against all odds, guided by figures like George Washington, they actually defeated the British, formalizing their independence with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. They built the world's very first democratic republic based entirely on human rights.
This was a real game changer for the modern world. The American Revolution proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that a nation could exist without a monarch, governed entirely by its own people. So, how did the success of that American Republic inspire a starving, heavily oppressed population back in Europe?
This brings us directly to domino number 3. Section 3, the impact of the French Revolution, the ideals of liberty. When those shiny new American ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity sailed back across the Atlantic to late 18th century France, they landed in an absolute powder keg. French society was divided into three estates. The first and second estates were the clergy and the nobility. Now, they made up just 2% of the population, but they held the vast majority of the wealth and paid nearly zero taxes. Meanwhile, the third estate, the commoners, the peasants, the factory workers, made up 98% of the country. They carried the entire economic burden of the nation on their backs while having virtually no political voice whatsoever.
So when King Louis XVI tried to squeeze them for even more taxes, the whole system just broke. The escalation was unbelievably swift and violent. That 98%er formed their own National Assembly. They took the famous tennis court oath to demand a brand new constitution, and by July 1789, the people literally stormed the Bastille fortress. The absolute monarchy was utterly dismantled, which ultimately culminated in the execution of the king by guillotine.
But revolutions are messy, right? While the uprising successfully crushed the old feudal order, it spiraled into this incredibly chaotic reign of terror under a radical group known as the Jacobins. We're talking thousands of executions. All this internal instability created a massive power vacuum. Amazingly, this paved the way for a single, brilliant military general, Napoleon Bonaparte, to seize power and declare himself emperor in 1804. Yet, even with the return to a monarchy, those democratic ideals unleashed by the revolution, they had permanently infected the rest of Europe.
But as these dominoes of democracy and human rights were tumbling through Europe, what was happening back in the newly formed United States? Well, a devastating internal crisis of identity and human rights threatened to permanently fracture the very nation they had just fought so hard to build.
That is Section 4, the American Civil War, a nation divided.
The country's unity was about to be put to the ultimate test. By 1861, the United States was basically two completely different countries sharing a single border. The Union in the North was heavily industrialized and increasingly pushing for the abolition of slavery. The Confederacy in the South, however, was heavily agricultural and entirely economically dependent on the brutal system of slave labor to harvest massive cash crops like cotton. So when Abraham Lincoln, who explicitly promised to stop the expansion of slavery, was elected president, the Southern states officially seceded to protect their slave-based economy.
The result was an all-out intrastate war, and the sheer brutality of it is hard to overstate. It resulted in a staggering 620,000 dead American soldiers. To put that into perspective, that was roughly 2% of the entire American population at the time. The scale of this internal conflict was completely unprecedented. Right midway through all this bloodshed, President Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. This is a massive, vital moment. It transformed the war from what was essentially a political battle over territory into a definitive moral crusade to abolish slavery completely. Ultimately, the Union Army, heavily bolstered by freed slaves joining their ranks, achieved victory. And that victory directly led to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, legally ending slavery and fundamentally redefining the United States as an indivisible nation, setting the stage for massive future growth. Which leads us to the final massive domino in our explainer today. Section 5, the Industrial Revolution, a world transformed.
If previous eras shifted how we governed ourselves, this era shifted how we literally lived our everyday lives. Moving from cottage industries to coal-fired, steam-powered machinery altered daily human existence more than anything since the discovery of fire itself. But why did this technological explosion kick off in Britain in the mid-18th century? It turns out they had the absolute perfect recipe. Geographically, being an island protected them from all those devastating land wars tearing up Europe. They were sitting on massive, easily accessible reserves of coal and iron. They had immense surplus capital pouring in from their overseas colonies, and crucially, they had a liberal, stable political system that allowed innovators, inventors, and the middle class to actually thrive and invest. Now, the ultimate economic consequence of all this machinery was the rise of capitalism. This system of free market production for profit drove spectacular technological advancement and created wealth on a scale no one had ever seen. But it also sparked a dramatic new class struggle. While wealthy industrialists were raking in the profits, factory workers toiled in brutal, wildly unsafe conditions for miserable pay. These harsh realities prompted thinkers like Karl Marx to propose alternative economic systems, like socialism, fundamentally shaping global politics in ways we still see to this very day.
So, as we wrap things up here, we've traced this incredibly complex path of human progress, from the humanist awakenings of the Renaissance, across the ocean for the birth of American democracy, through the violent fight for equality in the French Revolution, past the moral crucible of the American Civil War, all the way to the steam engines of the Industrial Revolution. Every single one of these eras was a necessary domino that had to fall to build the reality we wake up to today. Which leaves us with one pretty provocative thought. As we sit here right now, in our highly digital, hyper-connected era, what do you think is the next domino to reshape our world? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning history.